It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the FeBo team to our 15th webinar. The talks organized as part of our ERC FeBo project. FeBo is funded by the European Research Council and hosted by the Department of Humanities at the University of Trento. Our goal is to analyze the relevance of borders for federal states in antiquity, but also from a comparative perspective with modern times. Did the Greek koina have borders, intrafederal, internal borders, and interfederal borders, external, that is external borders? Were there linear borders or more border zones? Did the koina have a capacity to implement strategies to manage such borders? Or was it more a matter of political cultures of boundary management? You can find everything on our project, on our website, the FeBo website, and on the University of Trento YouTube channel, where there are the recordings of the past FeBinars. FeBinars are our think tanks. We have built, as I always say, a virtual lab in the framework of which we work on federalism and border management, and we periodically invite an external expert to our lab, let's say, to exchange ideas with us and to present us with cases by offering his or her expertise. As I said before, intrafederal borders and interfederal borders. We are aware that they cannot always be distinguished, that the former can easily become the latter, and the other way around, of course. But for pure reasons of defining a research path, we distinguish two distinct series of lectures, each with another focus, one on internal borders. The title of this series of lecture is The Management of Internal Borders by Federal States. The other on external borders, crossing federal borders, ancient and modern. This webinar is the 7th one of the FeBinar series, Crossing Federal Borders, focusing on external border areas of ancient Greek federal states. It will address the progressive move of Epirus peoples towards the consolidation of Canaan-like political structure and its coexistence with diverse internal organization, polis-like in some areas, but district-like in others. This kind of dynamics had, of course, an impact on internal and on external borders, their development, their changing over time, and of course, the way in which they need to be managed. We will be all ears today because there are issues, these are issues that we debate continuously and animatedly in the context of our internal FeBo team only workshops where we discuss preliminary results. Just the day before, yesterday, we returned to the problem of the chronology of border linearity and interfederal cross-border relations, as well as intrafederal interpolitic relation in the perspective of peer polity interactions. But let me also remind you that these FeBinars, all the FeBinars, also form part of a teaching project. The title of the teaching project is Conflict Management in Ancient Federal Greece, which is structured on two distinct levels, PhD students and MA students, respectively. Concretely, this means that two meetings take place before each webinar. One is coordinated by the FeBo team, by the postdocs, and is aimed at PhD students and history tutors, who are master students. Together, they read and comment on articles recommended by our guest. The same history tutors then hold a seminar, and that is a similar meeting for master students. And after the webinar, the same pattern is repeated to consolidate learning. It goes without saying that the postdocs meeting very often turn into research meetings. Back to our FeBinar and our guest today, who will be talking about Epirus and in particular a series of complex issues that contribute to the need to imagine and draw borders and then to change them over time. I refer to the collective identities of the three great ethne, to the processes of federalization, to the parallel formation of polis structures and districts, to the parceling out of communal collective identities only apparently contradictory to the processes of federalization, and thus to the need, in an alternating current, to define boundaries, internal or external, or to redefine them over time. Professor Adolfo Jerónimo Domínguez Monedero got his PhD in ancient history from the Complutense University of Madrid with a dissertation on colonización griega y mundo funerario indígena en el Mediterráneo occidental, and has been professor catedrático at the same university since 2009. His research has focused on the study of archaic Greece, mainly on Greek colonization in the Western Mediterranean, and he also worked on problems of ancient geography and pre-Roman population of the Iberian Peninsula, with a focus on the Phoenicians. He has participated in and led various research groups in different universities, both in Spain and abroad, such as, for example, he led, in particular, the Grupo de Investigación Helade, Grecia, Sociedades, Territorios y Estructura Políticas en la Antiquidad, where he is the director. And then he was part of the Copenhagen Polis Center and the research they carried out there, publishing a lot of volumes, and of the Iberia Greca group, Grupo Iberia Greca, of the Museo Arqueológico Nacional de España. He published a lot of books. All of us know them. One of the last books on Alexander the Great, on colonization in the ancient Mediterranean, on politics, territory, and identity in ancient Epirus, and also, for example, on Solon of Athens. So I think it is time to give him the floor. But before, I want to express my gratitude to Professor Domínguez Monedero for accepting our invitation to deliver a FeBinar for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for your kind presentation. I'm very glad to be here to participate in these wonderful FeBo seminars. And well, I shall try to tell something about I think that very difficult subjects such as the Epirus War, no, mainly through the lack of sources, no, which is our main problem. We have very few and very conflictive and difficult sources to try to know something about Epirus. Well, I shall share the screen. Okay. Okay. Is it okay?
Yes, we can see.
Okay. So I begin. Unlike other ethne being dealt with in these webinars, where political constructions develop at the same time as the ethnic identity of their components is being defined, the case of Epirus presents specific particularities. In the first reference we have to the territory which in time will make up the Epirot state, and which we find in the Homeric poems, reference is made to only one part of that territory, it's Prussia. Indeed, it is through its king Phaedon that Odysseus is able to gain access to Dodona to consult the Oak of Zeus for details on his return. We are also told that the Thesprotian ships were sailing towards Dulichium and that the Thesprotians and Ithaca were allies. In the Homeric poems, the word Epirus does not appear beyond its generic sense as a mainland or continental territory, but it is important that a people such as the Thesprotians, with a defined territory, although we are not informed of its boundaries, and with a king, Phaedon, and which has established relations of friendship or alliance with Ithaca, as well as sailing assiduously to Dulichium, is already mentioned. In spite of the fact that the 4th century author Theopompus mentions that there are 14 ethne in Epirus, in reality, is in Strabo's summary of the author of Chios, only 4 of them appear at first, clearly those which would end up being the most important and which, in all probability, ended up constituting autonomous political structures. In another Strabos passage, however, there is another list of Epirus peoples, not usually attributed to Theopompus, in which the Molossians are repeated. It is quite likely that in the original information of Theopompus, the Cassiopeans, together with other peoples not mentioned in Strabos' summary, appeared with their own personality. All of them, however, have been omitted by Strabo, who only mentions the Cassiopeans, but only to emphasize that they are also Thesprotians. It is difficult to know whether this reference corresponds to the original work of Theopompus, or whether Strabo, who does not mention other Epirus peoples, felt the need to emphasize the Thesprotian character of the Cassiopeans, since it must have been well known, and Theopompus would certainly have mentioned it, that this territory had been annexed to Molossia by Philip II around 342. This fact is indicated in the speech on Halonessus attributed to Demosthenes, which was delivered in the same year and in which both the attack on Ambracia and the surrender of the Cassiopeia to Alexander the Molossian are presented as taking place at the same time. Philip's action may also have had other consequences for the definition of the borders of Epirus, as we shall see later. Whether or not prior to that time the Cassiopeans were part of Thesprotia, as Theopompus Strabos' report suggests, is something that we cannot be sure of with certainty. If the panorama presented in the Periplus of Theodeschilax, a rather problematic work as it brings together situations corresponding to different historical moments, is anything to go by, the Cassiopeans are presented as an ethnos of their own, distinct from the Thesprotians and the Molossians, which has its own section in this work. There is, moreover, another argument to suggest that the Cassiopeans, with their principal cities, starting with Cassiope itself and continuing through Pandosia, Buceta, Elatria, and Bacchae, seem to have developed their own ethnic identity as a means of asserting their own personality, perhaps distinct from the Thesprotians, to whom they are assigned by Theopompus Strabo, and of course from the Molossians, into whose state they are forced to integrate by Philip II. This distinct personality links them to the Eleans, from whom they consider themselves colonists, as the text of the speech on Halonessus shows, and which has traditionally been interpreted as accepting a genuine colonization from this Peloponnesian people, of which there is no archaeological trace. Although there are still those who continue to accept the reality of this colonization, I believe that elsewhere we have presented sufficient arguments to question it. But we also have another element of great interest, namely the inscription that 3 notables from the city of Buceta dedicated in the Agora of Cassiope around 129 to commemorate their happy return after having collaborated with the Romans in the Aristonicus War, and where they proclaimed themselves to be of the lineage of Oxylus, the ancient settler of the territory. This is not a proof, as has recently been suggested, of the reality of this Elian colonization, but on the contrary, that the Casopians had constructed their identity on the basis of this mythical story, just as the Molossians had constructed their identity and that of the royal family through the Aeacid offspring, through Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. The case of the Casopians and their disputed identity is possibly one of the clearest cases in which we can perceive how the redefinition of borders between the different Epirot ethne has, in addition to a political and military aspect, another aspect in which the foundation myths play a fundamental role. The great eponymous center of the Casopians, the polis of Casope, would have been established at least before 360-355, because it is mentioned among the destinations visited by Theoroi of the sanctuary of Epidauros. We do not have enough details about his initial moment, since archaeology cannot give an exact absolute date, but it is possible that the creation of the great urban center was the result of a process of synecism. Through it, the city became the political, administrative, and symbolic center of the entire ethnos, whose population continued to live dispersed in other parts of the territory, articulated around the other cities of the Casopians we have mentioned, Pandosia, Buceta, Elatria, and Bacchae. This Casopian identity, to which the literary sources allude, is confirmed by the epigraphic testimony mentioned above, which shows how the Romans may have recognized this Casopian identity. This is what explains why the three notables of Buceta went to the political center of the ethnos, the city of Casope, to consecrate in its agora their estate to Heracles and the commemorative inscription. Another case in which the sources fluctuate is that of Cestrine, which in 433 appears as an entity distinct from Thesprotia, from which it is separated by the river Thiamis. Similarly, in the Periplus of Pseudo-Scylax, this territory is also explicitly mentioned, although in a place that does not correspond to it. However, in the enumeration of the coast itinerary, no direct reference is made to this territory between Caonia and Thesprotia, which suggests that it may have been incorporated into one of these two koina, with which it shared borders. The fluctuation is recorded in two separate entries by Stephanus of Byzantium. Another case of border redefinition concerns the sanctuary of Dodona itself, and Charlie, the territory. Indirect reference is found again in Strabo, when he states that the sanctuary and his territory had previously been under the control of the Thesprotians, but later came under the control of the Molossians. We are not told, however, how this change came about. We will return to this question later. These texts already introduce us to a theme that seems to be quite frequent in the case of Epirus, namely the relative fluidity of borders, through the existence of internal and external movements that cause different territories to change hands not in the remote past, but in fully historical periods. While the 14 ethne mentioned by Theopompus seem to have been simplified in favor of the emergence of the three great conglomerates represented by the Caonians, Thesprotians, and Molossians, we can go back a little in time to observe the situation presented by Thucydides around 429, when the Epirotes were deeply involved in the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides reports that it was the Caonians, together with the Ambrasians, who planned an expedition against the Acarnanians and persuaded the Spartans to lead it. Enlisting the forces at Cnemus' disposal, along with Peloponnesians who had arrived with the Navarchus, the Ambrasians, the Anactorians, and the Leucadians, he includes the barbarians, who make up the expedition, and who are composed of 1,000 Caonians, led by their prostatae, Photius, and Nicanor, an undeterminate number of Thesprotians, whose command is not indicated and who seem to have been allied with the Caonian Sinestrateuonto. Molossians and Atintans, led by Sabilinthus, the tutor of King Tharibs, still a child. Parabians, led by their king Oredus. With them go 1,000 other Orestians, who, though they have their own king, Antiochus, came under the command of King Oredus. This passage gives us an interesting insight into the situation in Epirus in the late 5th century. The primacy of the Chaonians, who promoted the campaign and seem to have been taking the initiative, is clear, which would be consistent with the idea expressed by Theopompus that the Chaonians had formerly primacy over the whole of Epirus. There can be little doubt that at this point the Chaonians are at the head of a symmachia, or alliance that encompasses the rest of those participating in the campaign. It is surely in this sense that the remarks highlighting the primacy of the Chaones and doxotatoi alluded to by Theopompus retrospectively in his work must be understood. On the other hand, it seems beyond doubt that at this time, the Thesprotians, of whom hardly any details are given beyond the fact that they have no king, must be allied through perhaps not in unequal alliance with the Chaonians. Finally, the Molossians are accompanied by the Atintans, although command is held by the Molossians. This would also suggest the supremacy of the Molossian over their neighbors. Furthermore, between the Orestians and the Parabians, there may also have been some kind of unequal alliance, since although both peoples have their own kings, the army is led by the king of the Parabians. Considering the number of peoples involved, 6 in total, we do not find traces of those 14 ethne to which Pompus alluded here either. A major problem is that we do not know what period the author of Chios is alluding to either. In any case, and for what we have already seen, and from what Thucydides' text implies, it seems that processes of political concentration have been taking place, which have been simplifying a possible previous situation. Although, in 429, there are still populations which in time will be integrated into other political structures, but which are still independent. In any case, it seems that the Atintans are already entering the Molossian orbit, since it's the latter who led their joint forces, and the same seems to be true of the Orestians and the Parabians, where it is the latter who led the common forces. Unfortunately, neither Thucydides provides us with a complete list of troops contributed by each of these peoples, with the exception of the Chaonians and the Orestians, nor do we have precise data about the territories occupied by each of these peoples, beyond some general outlines that have been attempted to be mapped on several occasions. Sorry. Yes, this is. The failure of the campaign against Acarnania after the defeat of the Epirot contingents at Stratus probably caused major upheavals in Epirus as a whole. The detailed information provided by Thucydides in this regard is a detailed account of the behavior of the Epirots, always barbarians for Thucydides, who contrast the good order and the advanced information of the Greeks, as well as the fact that they camped in a suitable place with the recklessness and arrogance of the Chaonians, who launched a direct attack against Stratus and were soundly defeated, losing a large number of men, which caused the rest of the Epirots to flee and ultimately the end of the campaign. Is, as Thucydides asserts and Theopompus still recall, the Chaonians had played a predominant role in Epirus as a whole up to that point. Their defeat, accompanied by the loss of considerable part of their forces, would not but bring about significant changes in the internal situation in Epirus and affect the other Epirot peoples. As it seems, the Thesprotians fought alongside the Chaonians, their defeat would also affect them, perhaps partly weakening them, but perhaps also allowing them to make territorial advances to the detriment of the Chaonians. This could have led to the fracture of the alliance, linking them to the Chaonians, which could have immediate consequences, perhaps one of them being the integration of Thestrine into Thesprotia. On the other hand, the Molossians seem to have been the main beneficiaries, at least in the medium term. Many of the sources that deal with this territory point out how King Tharibs moved or was forced to move to Athens, where he was educated and eventually returned to Molossia and introduced important changes in the social and political structure of the territory. It is in the period of this king's rule that Dodona's transition from the Thesprotian to the Molossian is usually placed, possibly after 410, since in Euripides' Phoenicae, Dodona is still called Thesprotian. The period of King Tharibs represents a fundamental change in the internal structure of the Molossian kingdom. The possible introduction of a political model more or less distantly inspired by the Athenian one, as ancient authors claim, surely gives a political rank within the kingdom to the different peoples and territories that are integrated into the state, and this may have been an interesting factor in explaining the expansion of the kingdom. Archaeology does confirm, at least in the Ioannina Basin, an important change with respect to previous times, marked by the appearance of a series of non-fortified settlements, but already following urban patterns hitherto unknown in this territory, but comparable to those known in other parts of Greece. Sites such as Agi Apostoli, Episcopi, and above all Ragi Platanias already show residential quarters separated by streets, a common open space, and a building of a possible cultic and political character. At the same time, the abandonment of traditional habitats composed of huts and without a defined urbanism, which had represented the areas of habitation in Molossia up to that time, seems to have begun. It is possible that, linked to this aspect of the internal definition of the Molossian territory, there is also the process of expansion of the frontiers, which may have been favored by the very type of structures that are emerging in Molossia. We will insist on this later, because the first evidence of this process of internal articulation dates from the time of King Neoptolemus, son of Alcetas. As for this latter king, Alcetas I, we know that his reign was rather tortuous, since he was for a time in exile in Syracuse, although he returned to Molossia with the support of Dionysius I and his Illyrian allies, albeit at the cost of a war which costed 15,000 casualties among the Molossians when the Illyrians took advantage of the situation to sack Molossia, and the Molossians were defeated in their confrontation with them. This eventually led to a Spartan intervention. These events would have been taking place around 385–84 BC, at least judging by the chronological framework in which Diodorus placed them. We do not know the causes of King Alcetas' exile, although they may have to do with conflicts between the king and his subjects. Elsewhere, I have suggested that perhaps through Spartan influence, some kind of mechanism might have been established on his return to ensure the stability of the kingdom on the basis of respect for laws, which in any case do not seem to have been written down. As is well known, Alcetas and his son Neoptolemus appear as signatories in Aristotle's decree making the creation of the Second Athenian League, and this is also alluded to by authors such as Diodorus and Cornelius Nepos. The latter give Timotheus the credit for not only bringing Corcyra under Athenian control, but also for the incorporation of Epirotes, Chaonian, Atamanians, and all those people who live near the sea as allies. Given that we know Alcetas was king of the Molossians, the appearance of the term Epirotes, which also explicitly excludes Chaonians and Atamanians, raises some interesting questions, since there is little doubt that these Epirotes must be those over whom Alcetas exercised power. Hammond was right when he suggested, and I quote, that here Epirotai might have been used to indicate a group of Epiroid tribes, which did not include the Caones and the Atamanes, but evidently included more than the Molossi. End of quotation. Brief note, Hammond speak about tribes. I prefer the term ethne, or people, or nations. Certainly today tribes must be, in my opinion, discarded, but I am quoting literally from Hammond, and I use his own expression. Continuing. This use of the term Epiroid as a means of referring collectively to some kind of a structure that may encompass more than one of these peoples is surely related to what I am most interested in emphasizing at the moment, and that is that it is practically certain that in the Alcetas period, unless it is something that arose in the time of tariffs, the Molossians have gained access to the sea. This would be confirmed by the so-called Periplus of the Pseudo-Aeschylus in his description of Molossia, which he placed following its sea route between Cassiopeia and Ambracia, suggesting that this outlet to the sea is in the Gulf of Ambracia. The information would be in any case prior to 344, when Philip ended the independence of Cassiopeia and annexed its territory to Molossia. In addition to this notice, we have another relevant piece of information, which on this occasion is transmitted to us by Xenophon and refers to events which occurred in 372. According to this author, the Athenians asked Alcetas to help them cross to Corcyra with 600 peltasts in order to ensure that their control over the island. Diodorus relates the episode modifying the number of peltasts to 500, but does not mention Alcetas' intervention. Of course, navigation from the Gulf of Ambracia to Corcyra is possible, but it seems that the crossing took place at night as attested by Xenophon and Diodorus, which would suggest that the starting points of the covert expedition must have been somewhere on the mainland coast opposite Corcyra. However, that coast is part of the territories of the Caonians and Thesprotians. This would suggest that at the same time as the Molossians are consolidating their political system, they are opening up directly to the sea, albeit only in that small stretch of 40 stadia between the Cassiopeans and Ambracia, but they are able to facilitate the crossing of the Athenians to Corcyra, probably through some kind of alliance with the Thesprotians or the Caonians who control the coast opposite Corcyra, although it has also been suggested that by this time the Molossians have already taken control of Thestrine, although there is not much evidence for this. This is possibly what is meant by the reference by Cornelius Nepos mentioned above, according to which Timotheus linked Athens to Epirotes, which would include at least the Molossians and the Thesprotians, but possibly not the Caonians and the Atamanians. We will mention later an epigraphic document that could perhaps confirm this. We must now consider the reign of Neoptolemus I, son of Alcetas, to be able to observe how the Molossian state presents a solid internal organization, combining political structures linked to population and territories that preserve in their names the traces of a past possibly of a village and pre- or proto-political character. The main and oldest testimony is a stele found in the sanctuary of Dodona, which contains 2 grants of Molossian citizenship to 2 women. This document has been the subject of heated debate in recent times, mainly due to some proposals that have tried to deprive it of its, in our opinion, clear political character in order to relegate it to the testimony of a simple and fictionic structure. I refer to the stele generally known as that of the Damiorgoi, one of the oldest public documents emanating from the Molossian state. I will accept the political character of this document, whose purpose, as has been said, is the granting of politeia to 2 women, and which presents some of the usual features of political decrees known to us in other parts of Greece for this time, which is between 370 368. In the first of the decrees, we can count, including the Prostates, the Grammateus, and the Damiurgoi, a total of 10 or 11 names that seem to correspond to as many political subgroups that participate through their Damiurgoi in the decision-making of the Molossian state. The leaders of this state, below the king, are the Prostates and the Grammateus, who also form part of one of these groups, which, from the name given to the representatives in the collective body, would have been called Damoi. The political nature of the collective body and of the decision taken seems beyond doubt, since it is a question of recognizing certain rights for a woman and her descendants. In the second degree, we find a similar formula in favor of another woman, but on this occasion the number of damoi present, including those of the magistrates, is reduced to 5 or 6, which would suggest that this other meeting, held in the same year but at a different time, was attended by only some of these damiurgoi, but not all of them. We also have another inscription, also found at Dodona, which we can consider to be somewhat complementary to the previous one, although on this occasion its chronology cannot be precisely established as its heading cannot be satisfactorily read. It is also an act of granting politeia and other privileges associated with it to 2 individuals, at least one of them from Naupactus, and his descendants by the Molossian estate, Tokoinon Tom Molosson, as it is called in the same inscription. The chronology traditionally assigned to this document, especially by Caban, would be somewhat earlier than 330. He also rejects the attempt to place it in the reign of Alexander II, 272-240, and denies any connection with any kind of amphictyonic structure. The heading, although destroyed, must have begun with the name of the king, probably that of the Prostates, which has not survived, followed by that of the Grammateus, which does appear in the inscription. The main difference with the previous inscription lies in the fact that the damiurgoi no longer appear, but in their place appear other individuals defined as synarchontes, which further clarifies their role as co-rulers or co-participants in the government of the koinon. What does not change, although there are now more of them, a total of 15, are the names of the political territorial structures they represent. Alongside these 2 inscriptions carved in stone, there is another document in bronze in which some of these names also appear. By the position they hold is that of hieromnamones, and the number of groups represented is smaller. It is interesting to note that in inscriptions granting citizenship rights and associated privileges, dated at least some of them to the reign of Alexander I, any mention of these names disappears completely. This may be due to the fact that the medium of this text is bronze, which may have made it necessary, due to the material used, not to include the names of all the synarchontes, or that the decision-making process has changed, or simply that without having changed the procedure in the text written and exhibited at Dodona, it is no longer considered necessary to explain how many and which individuals were involved in the promulgation of the decree. With regard to the ethnic names that appear in the 3 lists, some are better known than others, but I will dwell briefly on a couple of them. Let's start with Piales. His name would derive from Pielus, son of Pyrrhus Neoptolemus, whose relationship with Peleus, the father of Achilles, and thus ancestor of the Aescid royal house, is well known, and at least in Pyrrhus' time, he seems to have been considered the forefather of the family, as opposed to other versions which assigned this role to Molossus. The Piales would thus be the descendants of Pielus, just as the Genoaiae, the loss of their name, were the descendants of Genos. In addition to these names derived from the name of an ancestor, other names seem to refer rather to processes of concentration of destined groups in higher ranking structures, tripolitae or trifilioi. It seems that in the process of political configuration of Molossia in the Tsarist period, all pre-political structures based on destined groups or gene could be used at the basis of the new political structure, or in other cases, it was preferred to aggregate them into new structures, curiously enough, based on the number 3. By integrating them into a common structure, namely a koinon, eminently federal in character, local peculiarities linked to genealogical traditions would be preserved, but at the same time, the foundations of the koinons, citizenship and territoriality of the koinon would be laid. Once the purpose had been achieved, the functioning of which can be seen in the inscriptions mentioned before, it would be possible to start thinking in fully political terms, with well-defined borders, but at the same time open to new incorporations. Among these groups present in the already mentioned inscriptions, the presence of another of them, the Onopernoi, who appear as part of the Molossian koinon, but who in some cases are included among the Thesprotians, has sometimes attracted attention. This is suggested by an inscription from Dodona showing liberation of 5 slaves in which the witnesses are grouped according to their ethnos of origin, Molossians and Thesprotians. Within the latter, an Onopernian appears, and moreover, the text is dated by the Prostates Philoxenus, who is also an Onopernian. The interpretation given to this epigraph is unsatisfactory, since it suggests that the Molossians have integrated the Onoperno into their state, but soon recognizes their political rights as Thesprotians, which is contradictory, to the extent that the Prostate of the Molossians is also an Onopernian. In his 1976 book, Caban suggested dating it to around 334, 328, I quote, shortly after the union of the two tribes in the new Epirot state, end of the quotation. Much more surprising is the following statement, which starts from the idea that the creation of the new Epirot state might have involved a return of the Onopernians to the Thesprotians. I quote, as a gesture of goodwill, the Molossians agreed to return to the Thesprotian regions and populations that had once been theirs, such as the Onopernians, or that were very close to their own territory. End of the quotation. Apart from the improbability of this transfer of territories, there is another argument that would be strange if something similar to what Caban suggests has taken place. Among the Molossians, there are, in the inscription, 6 witnesses who are Dodonians, and since there is no doubt that their city and sanctuary were once Thesprotian, why would they not also have remembered the Thesprotian origins of these Dodonians? One possible solution would be to think that while the bulk of the Onopernians were integrated into the Molossian state together with their territory, some individuals may have continued to retain their Thesprotian citizenship because they had resided in other parts of Thesprotia outside the Onopernian territory, or they may have become Thesprotian citizens at a later point in time in accordance with their origins. In any case, the inscription shows the general trend of Molossian expansion, which seems to have taken place through the integration into the politeia of those destined groups and the territories they control with full rights. What the epigraphs, though not tell us, is whether this process of annexation and change of borders took place by consensus or, on the contrary, by the force. In the case of the Casopians, as we have already seen, it was external intervention, in this case by Philip II, that brought about this change of borders to the benefit of the Molossians. In this context, We must analyze another document also of debated chronology, which also poses interesting problems. It is a bronze plaque that does not contain an explicit political agreement and must be considered as a dedication halfway between private and public, perhaps intended to record political changes that have taken place in Epirus. The text identifies the plaque as a gift, Doron, offered to Zeus, governor and sovereign of Dodona, by a monk called Agathon, son of Epiphilos and his Zacynthian descendants, who have been proxenoi of the Molossians and their allies for 30 generations, since the days of Troy, and who are of the lineage of Cassandra. Given that, except for a few unimportant traditions, Cassandra had no children, Agathon's links with Cassandra's lineage must have been through some figure associated with her. Fraser suggests that it could have been another Agathon, Cassandra's brother, who appears just one in the Iliad, although we should not rule out the other more famous brother, Helenos, who was also her twin. We came to have a much more intense relationship with Epirus in mythological tales. Although we find it difficult to believe that the proxeny relationship between Agathon's family and the Molossians may have lasted the 900 or 990 years indicated by the text, the truth is that for those who drew up the text of this epigraph, this formed part of their perception of the past, with the length of the association adding even greater value to the relationship. This was even more so in view of the fact that it dated back to one of the main chronological landmarks recognized by all the Greeks, namely the Trojan War. Nevertheless, we cannot lose sight of the fact that in the Odyssey establishes a relationship between Thesprotia, who has ships, and Ithaca, and Dulichion, which, whatever its exact location, was within the radius of Ithaca, as illustrated by the fact that Penelope's suitors came from there, from Same and from Zakynthos. Consequently, it's hardly to believe that the epigraph of Agathon of Zakynthos would refer to a proxeny that lasted 30 generations between the Molossians and the islands, since it is difficult to make out what interests the Molossians and inland people would have had in common with the Ionian island. It is easier to believe that the Zacynthians would have established a proxeny link with the Thesprotians, with whom, furthermore, the Homeric tradition establishes certain ties, although indirect, focusing on the Thesprotian sanctuary of Dodona. However, once the Molossians had taken over the sanctuary and, above all, established an alliance with other neighboring peoples, including the Thesprotians, or a part of them, Agathon would have considered this a good opportunity to send his inscription to Dodona in order to recall his ancient proxeny, now headed by the Molossians, although the remainder would have also included their allies, the Thesprotian among them, with whom the proxeny in origin has been established. We should not lose sight of the fact that Agathon's offering was made to Dodonian Zeus, which would represent the element of continuity over and above the contingent fact of who actually controlled the sanctuary, and that it was formulated as this gift that I send to you, Zeus, from me. Although we are dealing with a rather isolated testimony of the relation that existed between Epirus and Zakynthos, the existence of this document forces us to consider what moved Agathon to recall the extremely ancient tradition of proxeny with the Molossians at Dodona and to link it to the figure of Cassandra. The existence of local traditions that tied individuals and peoples to ancient heroes from the epic and mythical tradition is well known in the Greek world and in Epirus itself, and although some documents have survived that might shed some light on the matter, in others we must simply content ourselves with the existence of the documents in question, without being able to discern any further details regarding their origin and the mechanism used to bring them about. One of the most obvious problems regarding this inscription is dating, which from the moment it was discovered has varied from around 370 to to the beginning of the 3rd century, with a large number of estimates revolving around the 2nd half of the 4th century. Hammond has already observed that the formula proxenoi moloson kai simmachon had parallels in other cases, which first tended to mention the state that possessed the hegemony and the allies that would be represented by delegates on a council. This led him to date the epigraph back to the last years of the reign of Alexander I. For his part, Caban is right when he states that this expression corresponds to a period of very short duration, one in which the Molossians had incorporated neighboring peoples into an alliance, but without yet having brought about full integration, although in a subsequent war he considered this to be a practical formula instead, but, I quote, without any real institutional content, end of the quotation. After rallying out the idea that we could be dealing with an organization comparable to the Delian League or the Peloponnesian Confederation of the 5th century, which employed a similar formula, he considers it to be an expression that designates the Molossians and their neighbors that have been more or less absorbed into the same state, the Ayyacid monarchy. Only in Agathon's inscription do we find the expression the Molossians and their allies, which is unknown in the epigraphy produced by the Molossian state. The exception would be due to the fact that we are dealing with a document produced in Zakynthos and by Zakynthsians, who would have considered it necessary to include the allies so that, as we have seen, they can make those 30 generations tally with the ongoing relations that Agathon wishes to date back to the Homeric period, a time in which, as everyone knew, Dodona was under Thesprotian control. What we conclude from everything we have seen up until now is that at some point in the 4th century BC, some indeterminate point, given that the letter type I used in the Arthon inscription does not help us to gain a more precise idea in chronological terms, the Zakynthsians, through the auspices of the proxenos of the Molossians, Agathon, felt the need to recognize the new political situation that an expanding Molossia was bringing about. In this respect, we might recall Nepos' account in which he declares that Timotheus made the Epirotes, Athamanians, and Chaonians allies, even though it's well known that we have also seen that it was the king of the Molossian, Alcetas, and his son Neoptolemus who entered into an alliance with Athens. Although nothing we have seen here constitutes solid proof, we have a series of concomitant circumstances that might suggest that Agathon would have sent his plague to Dodona during the reign of Alcetas I, although this is a date that the critics do not generally accept, except for the oldest studies. This was also a moment in which both Epirus and Zakynthos once again came within the Athenian orbit, featuring a more stable situation following Alcetas' traumatic recovery of the Molossian throne. Other moments in the 4th century might also be possible, such as the period of Aribas' reign, or more probably the period following his expulsion at the hands of Philip II and Alexander I's accession to the throne in around 342, when Molossia incorporated new territories. Insofar, we have been dealing mainly with territorial gains on the part of the Molossians. The question of possible losses should be raised. During the Spartan campaign of 429, among the peoples involved are the Orestians and the Paraveans, who come together under the leadership of the latter's king Oretus. Clearly, these contingents are Epirotes, since the Macedonians, sent by King Perdiccas II, are listed separately. However, at later times, Orestis is part of Macedonia. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, for example, who would have been born around 367, would have been from Orestis, according to some sources, although according to others, he was from Eordea. In any case, several Orestians are known to be Macedonians, among them Pausanias, the assassin of Philip II. It would therefore seem that this territory bordering Macedonia would have come in whole or in part under Macedonian control and the Macedonian control. The same seems to have happened with the region of Parabea. It is known that in 294, when Epirus of Epirus came to the aid of Alexander V of Macedonia, he asked him for the territories of Stymphea and Parabea as payment for his alliance, as well as the newly acquired territories of Ambracia, Acarnania, and Amphilochia, which he fortified immediately after receiving them. Proxenus, the historian of Epirus, also mentions Stymphea as an Epirus territory, as well as Parabea, but this is of little importance because he might have done so after its integration into Epirus by Pyrrhus. In that region, the river Athos has its sources, as Strabo points out. It can long be considered that Philip's second campaign in Epirus in 344 may have brought Parabea, Atintania, Tymphaea, and Orestis under Macedonian authority, although it cannot be ruled out that this may have taken place in the earlier campaign against Aribas before 349 BC. Pyrrhus would have merely recovered some of these territories. It is now time to consider other documents of great interest, such as the list of Theodorokoi of Epidaurus and Argos, which show the situation of two different moments in the 4th century. This is also a partial and external view, but it shows the international projection of the Epirus territories at both times. In the first of the documents, the section that interests us mentions the following political structures that were to receive the sacred ambassadors from the sanctuary of Asclepius. Here we have the list. Leaving aside Ambracia and Corcyra, which are Corinthian colonies, the situation shown in the Epidaurian epigraph presents 7 states, to which perhaps some others should be added, such as Smarazza, which appears as an addition in the 2nd column of the inscription. Thus, the 3 great koina already known from the end of the 5th century, Molossians, Thesprotians, and Caonians, appear, as well as Cassope and Pandosia, still as independent states, and 3 other poleis whose location is disputed, such as Poionos, Archigia, and Smarazza. The heading that encompasses almost all of them, Epirus, seems to be understood in a geographical sense, since it seems that the Epirus state had not yet arisen. But in any case, it is interesting that the term Epirus appears. This does not rule out the possibility that within the territory there may have been intermediate models of interaction, such as the symmachia between Molossians and others mentioned in the inscription of Agathon of Zakynthos. The establishment of military alliances with its neighbors is certainly one of the mechanisms used by Molossia to become a regional power, as was the dynastic marriage between Olympias and Philip II brought about by Aribas in 357. Although the results were not as expected, as Justin indicates. In fact, a few years later, in Demosthenes' first Olympian speech, delivered around 349, mention is made of an attack by Philip II on Aribas, perhaps because Molossia was pursuing a policy that did not interest the Macedonian king. As is well known, and as the above-mentioned passage from Justin foretold, Philip would eventually drive Aribas from his throne and hand it over to a more loyal ally like Alexander I the Molossian. It is in the time of this king, Alexander the Molossian, that the description of the Theodorokoi of Argos is dated, since, as we shall see, it is Cleopatra, the wife of Alexander I, who appears in the epigraph in this role, which would have taken place either during the king's stay in Italy or after his death in 331. The situation presented by this other document is already quite different from that which had existed some 30 years earlier. There are now only 2 entries referring to Epirus, which he already has a clear political meaning, since the aforementioned Cleopatra appears as the Theodorokos of the state. The other Epirot entry refers to Phoenike, in which 3 Theodorokoi are mentioned. The fact that it appears in an entry other than the Epirus entry, I quote, does not prevent the Chaonians from forming part of Cleopatra's Aperos either. It simply proves that Phoenice, a polis, was visited by the Argos Theories, end of the quotation by my colleague José Pascual. We do not know to what extent, except for the cases already mentioned, these processes that took place in Epirus, especially during the reigns of Aribas and Alexander I, affected the borders of the different states that until then, and which, from the creation of the state known as Apeiros and possibly Koinonton Apeirotan, would become internal borders between the different components of the new Epirote state. For this early stage of the Epirote state, we still have little data, and although they were never abundant, it is only in later times that we observe the appearance of new internal divisions, such as, after the Roman conquest, the rise of structures like the koinon of the Praesaiboi, which I will not deal with here. The only more or less fixed boundaries that we now are those along the coastline, as described in the Periplus of Pseudo-Aeschylus, although he gives only the length of the stretch of coast that they control, using the old system of days of navigation. Only in the case of Thesprotia is the port of Elaia and the mouth of the river Acheron mentioned. The section of territories, Chaonia, Thesprotia, Casopia, Molossia, with their corresponding measures is quite precise. Only in the northern part around the Ceraunian mountains, there is some problem. Oricum would be part of Epirus, and possibly also Amantia and Bilis, but their borders seem to be confused with those of the Illyrians, and there is no unanimous agreement about the ethnicity of those populations, even though there are more elements that seem to link them to the Epirote world than to the Illyria. A final aspect I would like to discuss concerns the external frontiers. In Diodorus' account of the return from exile of King Alcetas, he refers to the great damage caused by the Illyrians. The great problem of ancient territories was the relative ease with which enemies could penetrate them and attack their inhabitants, their property and their crops, and Molossia seems to have been no exception, nor was the Epirote state that would emerge from the last third of the 4th century onwards. There are many cases in which enemies penetrate into Epirus, or even prevent the Epirotes from leaving their territory, as when Cassander's general Atarias occupied the passes leading out Epirus in 317, reducing Aiacides to impotence. After the positions of King Aiacides, Cassander sent Lykiskos as general and as governor, although this was possible because he had the support of the Epirotes who had expelled Aiacides and who had established an alliance with Macedonia. Similarly, Pyrrhus begins his reign because the Illyrian king Glaucias leads him to Epirus accompanied by a military force, but he himself has to experience an invasion of his territory at the hands of Demetrius, partly because of a miscalculation. He was unable to intercept the Macedonian army that plundered his territory. In return, Pyrrhus also managed to penetrate into the heart of Macedonia. In general, these expeditions were not so much aimed at conquering territory as at taking booty. Undoubtedly, one of the thoughtiest expeditions for Epirus was the one led by the Aetolian general Dorymachus, who reached Dodona in 219, causing great damage to the sanctuary. It was indeed difficult to defend a vast territory with multiple access routes, and it seems that at least until the time of Pyrrhus, there was no serious attempt not only to defend the frontiers, but also to protect the population. The newly built settlements in the Ioannina Basin do not seem to have shown in any interest in fortification, and Frontinus has preserved an interesting account from the reign of King Aribas, perhaps around 360, in which he orders the evacuation of the non-combatants from the territory, while with the combatants he dedicates himself to ambushes in the mountains and in places of difficult access, which he managed to defeat the Illyrians who were busy plundering. Recent studies, such as that of Gerogiannis, have shown how, especially from the reign of Epirus onwards, a process of construction began of fortified enclosures of different sizes and locations in a large part of the territory of Molossia and the whole of Epirus, which were to serve above all to give refuge to the rural populations and eventually to concentrate troops to fight possible invaders and above all to protect the frontiers. Roman sources refer to the Stena in Chaonia, the Fauces at Antigoneam, or the Par-Antigonean Stenoi, which control access from the coast inland, and to the Castra Pyrrhi, located in Triphylia of Molossia. All this suggests that, especially from Pyrrhus onwards, the main dangers that Epirus considered they had to face were raids in search of booty, but without rolling out other more organized types of attack that required controlling the border crossings to prevent the entry of enemies, although this could be difficult as some of the cases mentioned above show. This showed that the way to get rid of invaders was, as was common in the Greek war, to gather the army and seek to fight in the open. Some fortification would prevent non-combatants from fleeing and ensure their protection, while appropriate measures were taken, while others, such as the Castra Pyrrhi or the Stena, would be places in the border areas to hinder the passage of the enemy. What is of great interest is that these processes of fortification construction took place from the end of the 4th or beginning of the 3rd centuries BC onwards, and that before that time, defensive structures are rather scarce in Epirus. The already mentioned fact that the new settlements in the Ioannina basin were not fortified suggests that they did not fear attacks from their nearest neighbors, and that relations between the different ethne in Epirus before the creation of the common state must have developed within mechanism where violence was not the main mechanism. As we have seen, in 429, all the Epirotes led by the Chaonians decided to fight against the Acarnanian, possibly because they were integrated in the same alliance. On the other hand, as the power of the Molossians increased as shown by their expansion, it's not clear whether this was done through the use of violence or by attracting the border population and integrating them into their own politeia, something that might have happened with the Dodonaians and the Onopernians. The extension of frontiers does not seem to have implied the appearance of fortifications to defend them, and rather it would seem that a mechanism of interaction had been developed, such as that attested by the inscription of Agathon of Sakinsons, when he mentioned the Molossian and their allies. The use of this formula has attracted attention, and even more so that employed by another inscription found in Dodona and dated to the reign of a Neoptolemus son of Alexander, and in the Prostasia, the Molossian of Vandercas, in which Hoisimbahoi ton Apeirotan grant to one Cleomachos Atintan Ateleia and Enteleia in Epirus. Although this document has been commented on in many ways, Larsen may already have found the correct solution when he interpreted the text as referring to the allied Epirus and not the allies of the Epirus, and when he observed that, I quote, from the point of view of ordinary Greek usage, Symmachia is a misnomer. The confederacy was rather a sympoliteia. End of the quotation. At least from 429 onwards, many of the peoples who almost a century later give rise to the Epirote state had maintained military alliances that may have involved more interaction between their members than was usual in the Symmachis elsewhere in Greece. The greater or lesser weight of each of the members of this system would have allowed for fluctuation in the territories that each controlled through the attachment of member units to one or another koinon as circumstances changed. The Casopians integrated other groups that had previously developed their identity, considering themselves descendants of the Eleans. The Cestrinians were integrated into Thesprotia, but perhaps the Molossians also had some control over that territory. Of course, also the Chaonians. the Dodonians or the Onopernians moved from Thesprotia to Molossia. Unfortunately, we do not know the specific mechanism, and our sources do not inform us whether these changes were imposed or consensual, but the significant absence of fortification in Epirus before the end of the 4th century does not speak in favor of a permanent war situation. So we must think that these changes in the borders did not increase internal tensions. The most radical changes, however, took place at the time of the creation of the Epirot state, when the intervention of Philip II of Macedonia significantly increased the dominion of the Molossians, to whom the Cassiopeia was annexed, but from whom the territories bordering Macedonia were taken away, some of which were eventually recovered by Epirus. Epirus continued his expansionist dynamic while initiating a new policy aimed at protecting the external borders of Epirus and creating areas of refuge and shelter within the territory as a means of safeguarding the lives and economic interests of the Epirotes in the event of external invasion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this wonderful and rich webinar you gave for us. I took a lot of notes. So I would suggest that the floor is now open for questions or remarks, both here in the room or online. If you want to ask a question online, you can simply write the question in the chat, or even better, you can raise your hand and ask the question live. Thank you. Professor Buraselis, maybe? Did you raise your hand? Yes. Did I see it correctly?
Just a few words. First of all, I'm very glad to see Adolfo again and many other friends, at least on screen. We should not say bad things about our age, since it presents possibilities we never had before. I found all this very interesting. I had the impression that, dear Adolfo, you were trying to create a synthesis out of an epirotic house, I would say. And I'm sure you understand what I mean with this. I have no objection to what you said. Simply, you could have underlined, perhaps even more, the importance of the royal institution in this area, because it is not accidental that only the Epirotic tribe, Molossians, who were able to present a strong royal solution, so to say, seem to have a prospect of success in Epirus. And as I have come in the late period to deal myself with a late offspring of Epirotic royal ambitions, the Athamanians, who were very adroitly posed at the border between Epirus and Thessaly and Macedonia, as you know, the Pindos people. I have tried to see there also the importance of the royal institution. The existence of a king was a sort of international identity to present to many directions. And even after Pyrrhus, I have the impression that this is a paradox or an oxymoron, perhaps. Epirotic history after Pyrrhus is inconceivable without the past of Pyrrhus. Well, just this. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. I'm so very glad to see you, Costas, through the screen. I absolutely agree with you. Of course. I have only 1 hour to to talk. Certainly, I absolutely agree with you with the importance of the monarchy in Epirus. Certainly, of course, Alexander I is the before Alexander the Molossian. Epirus is very backward territory, but Alexander is the first. We can make a campaign in Italy, something absolutely impossible in an disunited Epirus. So certainly, beginning with Alexander the Molossian, of course, continuing with Pyrrhus, but perhaps the monarchy of Alcetas I, I think that of Cyrus, certainly there are many kings. I have mentioned all of them, but I have no time to insist in the paper. But absolutely, I agree with you. The importance of the monarchy to understand the historical evolution of Epirus. Of course. Thank you very much.
Any more questions or remarks?
I'm afraid I have to talk about frontiers because the frontier lines are very, very unknown in this territory.
No, but it was very interesting also from the point of view of the concept of frontier, what you showed us. I have a short question about this issue. You showed us some documents in which the words either politeia or, I know, completely different, symmachia, or I'm thinking of molosonkai symmachon, recur very often. What about sympoliteia? Do we have any inscriptions or, I don't know, some passages by Thucydides, for example, or later historians using the word sympoliteia with reference to Epirus or one of the ethne or the different parts and districts, all the rich and varying cases you showed us?
The present moment, I don't remember. Of course, Thucydides, for Thucydides, the Epirotes are barbarians. This is no problem. So he has not much interest in talking about. He says that all the Epirotes sinestrateuonto. He doesn't use symmachia for the Molossians, perhaps because he thinks that as the Molossian, the Epirotes are barbarians, the term symmachia was too impressive. But he speaks about syntrateuonto. They fought together, which obviously is a symmachia. But Thucydides is not of use. In the rest of the authors, I don't remember. Certainly, when Pyrrhus goes to Italy, the army is divided between Caones, Molossian, and Thesprotians. That is, the national boundaries are well defined within his realm. But there is perhaps the most near to what asked. We know that Pyrrhus establishes two new cities, two new foundations. One of them in the territory of Caonians. So the king of all Epirus has the capability of plant new cities not only in Molossia, but also in Caonia. So what I mean, that the monarchy, and I recall the role of the monarchy, has the capacity of cross borders. The king is as in Macedonia, is perhaps the owner of all territory. Does this mean that there is Sympolitia? We don't know, because as far as I remember, there is not any direct evidence for this. But the king has the capacity of use, as he will, all the territory of the state, of the Epirus. So while the national boundaries are kept, at least in the army, in the organization of the army, the king has the capacity of intervene in all the territory. He can found cities. He has other of the kings, perhaps Alexander the Second, perhaps, has the capacity of preserve a part of the territory, in this case in Kestrine, for their own ends. So it's a very, I would call a very peculiar federal state, in which the king has perhaps more competences than each one of the koina, because we know that is prostateston moloson, prostateston haunon, prostateston thesproton. We see this in the period of the Roman conquest, no? Livius gives not a very good information, but certainly in the moment in which the territory, the state collapses, the prostatae of the three main units of the kingdom, of the koinon, disintegrates. So perhaps the king is the unifying force in Epirus, and perhaps through his relation with the different koina, one can talk about Sympoliteia, but it is a difficult question. I have not a positive answer, but I think that it's a very peculiar federal state. I think that it is a federal state with a very large autonomia of their components. It is shown in the moment of the Roman penetration. No, the state collapses because each one of the koina change his posture. Molossians are kept the alliance with the Macedonians, but the Caunians make an alliance with the Romans. Consequently, the state disappears because the main objective of the state, which is the political and mainly the military union, collapses absolutely. So perhaps they didn't develop a marked sense of Sympoliteia. I don't know. It's a thing that I am talking about, but I have not answered at the moment.
Thank you. Any other questions? Otherwise, I take advantage of my position again to ask one more question. Coming back to Thucydides and the capacity of Synstratewe, in which, if I correctly remember, Thucydides very often uses, also with reference to other regional ethne of central Greece, is this capacity to Synstratewe the beginning of something more than a regional unity?
Mm-hmm.
Does federalism start with this?
I think so. Because we do not know what relationship unites all the Epirotes, but according to Thucydides, are the Caonians who with the Ambrosians, who asked the Spartans to begin the war against the Acarnanians. So the Caonians are representing, I have perhaps they have not the power. Theopompus says that they were, if I don't recall, but endoxotatoi, the Chaonians, no, in previously, but that implies a kind of alliance. I think so. I think so. Thucydides doesn't explain why the Epirotes go to the war. He doesn't explain it. He tells Chaonians and Ambracians ask the Spartans to lead the campaign. He mentioned the troops, Peloponnesian and the Corinthian colonists in the most part who intervene, and the barbarians, the Epirotes. But he doesn't say why the barbarians follow the Chaonians. So perhaps his audience knew well, or he is not interested in it, because even the description of the campaign is very interesting, because he make a very, very sharp difference between the attitude of the Greeks, organized, camping adequately, and the recklessness of barbarians. He is obviously trying to show that the Epirotes are barbarians that fight with very, very, very few thinking. They attacked recklessly, and they are absolutely routed by people who are not the paradigm of civilization, against the Acarnanians. What is the structure of Acarnania in that moment? Perhaps it's not very different, but the same is marked in Thucydides between Aetolians and Acarnanians. The Acarnanians, as allies of Athens, are civilized. The Aetolians, as they are enemies of Athenians, are almost barbarians. They speak a very unknown language, and they say that they eat raw meat. So clearly Thucydides is marking his preferences according to his interest. So for me, it's not strange that Thucydides don't mention the organization of the Epirotes, because they are barbarians, and he wants to stress the barbarian origin. So it's interesting. At the same time, in Athens, Euripides is stressing the Hellenic heritage of the Molossians in his Andromache. In his Andromache, Euripides stressed the origin of the Molossian in the lineage of Neoptolemus. So in the same Athens, perhaps there are different visions. Tharips is educated in Athens, and he receives Athenian citizenship. A barbarian receiving Athenian citizenship is not impossible, but perhaps for many Athenians, the Epirotes were not so barbarians as Thucydides wants to make them. No, so I think that there is a bias in Thucydides with reference to the Epirotes. So for this reason, I think that he perhaps knew more things that he is telling us, and choosing his words, perhaps.
Thank you. There is one more question by Professor Buraselli.
Just a remark. I fully agree with what Adolfo said, and as your general subject concerns borders, I would phrase realities thus: the border between ethnic identity and political identity seems to be often non-existent in ancient Greece, especially when we identify political identity with political interest. For Thucydides, these were barbarians according to their usages, customs, and so on. One can also understand that Thucydides could not even smell Aetolian meat. Well,
Mhm.
you can understand what this means. And we should keep that in mind. Perhaps this is the most modern aspect of ancient history we could think of. Just this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I agree with you.
Well, thank you very much. So if there aren't any other questions or remark, I express my gratitude again to Professor Domínguez Monedero for this wonderful talk, and also to Professor Borazelis for his questions and remarks. And I remind you our next appointment, which is in September. Sylvain Fachard will deliver a talk about borders, not a federal talk, about borders in Attica. So see you again in September with our FeBinars. All welcome, of course. Bye.
Fine. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody. And I see Claudia. Bye, Claudia. And thank you very much to everything.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.